Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the 13th episode of my backyard plant propagation series. This week I'm going to be doing cuttings from plants that have a very specific way to do them. They're actually things that are kind of easy to root as long as you do them exactly the way I'm going to show you. I have failed many times with these things. I've got Nandinas, I've got Camellias, I've got dwarf Yaupon Hollies. Yaupon Hollies are native to the southeast. This dwarf variety is very, very popular. It's very difficult to root unless you do it the way I'm going to show you, and then it actually roots in the 80 to 90% range. And I've also got some lilacs. Lilacs can be a little tricky if they're done too early or too late, but not as tricky as the other three items. I'm going to start off with camellias. Camellias actually are pretty easy to root. They take a long time in the house. Let me show you here. We're going to take one of these branches from this year's growth that's hardened off. And what I'll normally do is I'll count about 5 leaves back. We'll count those top two as just one, but that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right in this area right here, about where that 6th leaf is, I'm going to cut it off, and I'm going to take that leaf off the bottom, which will peel that base for me. That is about the only place on a camellia that will root well, is about the 6th leaf going into the soil. This upper part right here, it will root sometimes, but just inconsistently. And the harder wood further back in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th leaf will sometimes root and sometimes not. A lot of times they'll callus and then just never root. It'll just sit in there forever. It doesn't decline, it doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't grow. It'll just sit there for a prolonged period of time. But this is the spot, and I'll stick this about halfway down, as we always do, and pinch it in. That's a perfect camellia cutting. I could probably go between the 4th and 5th leaf or the 5th and 6th leaf and be fine on these. So they're pretty easy to take. You know, all I have to do is do this count, you know, pretty much every time, and I'll cut it right up under that one. If the leaf doesn't peel the bottom piece off, which that one did, then you can go and scrape it like we do sometimes. And we'll dip it and stick it about halfway in and do it. So you can see it's very, very quick, but it has to be very, very precise. The next thing I'm going to do is a dwarf Yaupon Holly. Where these branches on this year's growth converge, right here at the bottom of this stem, that is where the roots are going to come from. They actually root from the bottom of that branch where it comes off the side. If I try to take just this little branch right here, which on any other holly would root, they root very ineffectively. The best piece is this piece right here. And the other thing is, I have found is if I stick this long stem down in here, it'll end up rotting and I don't get the rooting that I'm looking for. So what I do is take this whole piece where these branches come together, and I'll kind of hold them together and take off a lot of that top growth right there. And then I'll actually cut this stem to where there's almost nothing left of it. And then I dip this just like that, and I practically sit it on top of the soil like that. And that dwarf Yaupon Holly right there will almost certainly root. I tried these lots of other ways over the years, but I have found that no matter where I stick it, the roots always come out from where the branches meet the stem on this year's growth. So I just take off the lowest stems off of it, and I'm left with that. Like I say, I'll hold them together like that, cut that stem to where it's very little left, dip it, and stick it in there just barely. And so if it's windy or anything, these can actually blow off the flat. So keep that in mind. You wouldn't want these near your fan or anything like that in a greenhouse, but it's because they're practically just sitting on top of the ground. But I have very high success rate doing them this way. I'm going to do a couple rows of these dwarf Yaupon Hollies. There's our dwarf Yaupons. This is a Nandina. This is a harbor dwarf Nandina. And you'd think that this big piece I took here is going to yield me lots and lots of cuttings. But unfortunately, it's not. The only thing that really roots on Nandinas well is where all these branches come together, and this wood is right here. This is a harbor dwarf. This is a firepower Nandina. You can have a 3-foot firepower Nandina and maybe only get 10 or 15 cuttings off of them. They can be really, really frustrating that way. But none of this stuff up here at the top will root. It's only this brown stem right here, and it roots very effectively. It's a little bit slow to root, but it roots at a very, very high percentage as long as that's the thing that you're sticking in the soil. The problem with these is, look, when I put this in here, look how big it is. That's a real issue. You really have to go after these and trim them back quite a bit. I'll get a lot of these side pieces off here. I'll shorten this branch up to where I'm just barely getting some of that brown part of that stem under the soil. I'll put a little scrape on the side of that, and I'm actually going to go after this even a little bit harder here and cut it down to that, and maybe even that. And that's completely adequate right there. I've got the new growth is going to come out of the center right here, and the roots will come out of the brown part right here below the soil. We'll dip that and stick it in here, and that will root. It'll take a little while to root. Everything I'm putting in this flat today actually is a little slow rooting. This stuff is going to definitely end up in the greenhouse over the winter or in some sort of protected space, because we'll probably just be beginning to get roots on them as it's getting cold. I'm just going to cut the majority of that foliage off, cut this stem down to where I just barely have any of that brown material left. Cut this down to about like that, and that's plenty of green growth. I definitely do not want to top this, because right there is where my new growth is going to emerge from after it roots. Stick it about halfway down, pinch it in. I'm going to do a couple rows of these Nandinas. This is a Miss Kim Lilac. Most lilacs are pretty easy to root, but they need to be hardened off to where that stem turns green like this. It's a much lighter green color early in the season, and I'll go up here in the top of this and take that top leaf out like that. With this one, I'm actually going to take it right up below that second leaf node, take those two off like that, and that's an absolutely perfect cutting. I'll stick that about halfway in and pinch it in, and I'll show you that again. I'll take that top two leaves off there. I'll cut it right below that second group that I have down that are left, and take that off right there. Anything lower on that stem roots extremely, extremely slowly. And I find if I mix this together, if I take stems that are way down here and stems that are up here, they root at such a different rate that I end up damaging one or the other. So every time I'm just going to take those top two leaves out, I'm going to cut it below that second group of leaves, take it off like that. I can put a mark on it if you want to, take a little bit of the stem off. I never really have a problem with these. You got two leaves coming off the base of them, and usually that's a good spot for them to root from. Again, tops off, second leaf back, take those two pieces off. That cutting is good to go. Dip it, put it in about halfway and pinch it in. So that's it. I'm going to finish this flat out with these lilacs. So here's our completed flat. Again, the flats and all the information on the soil I use and the tools I'm using are all in previous videos. They're also linked in the description of this video if you're interested in purchasing any of the materials that I use in the propagation videos. I've labeled all of them. This is a Miss Kim Lilac, Firepower Nandinas, Dwarf Yaupon Hollies, and the Yudetide Camellia. We'll go ahead and slide this into the hoop house. So here's our Lilacs, Nandinas, Yaupon Hollies, and Camellia flat here. This is a flat we had done from last week. This is the butterfly bush here. If you have leaves fall off of anything, make sure you're disposing of those. Go through occasionally and clean them up. You'll lose a few leaves on a few things, and you don't want those laying around. They'll actually keep the soil way too wet underneath the leaves. We've got roots on our gardenias now. We've got roots on our gold mound spirea. We have roots on, as we've seen, on the crepe myrtles, and we know that those lantana are fully rooted in. And everything else that has been in here for a little while is calloused. Even these little sedum succulents we did last week are starting to harden off on the end. It won't take them very long to start rooting either. So anyway, I'm going to take a break from this series for a couple of weeks, and when we come back, we're going to take 2 or 3 flats out of this house and then add some more things to it, and eventually we'll get to doing some conifers as well going into fall, and I'll show you how to winterize these things. So I'm going to take a couple week break and be back in about the 1st of August and continue on Thursdays with this series. Thanks for watching.